Hey, good morning, everybody. It is Wednesday, May 27th. Oh, my hair's a little crazy. That's okay. Um, anyway, talking to other teachers, I know that Mrs. Lapointe is planning on giving her final test, I believe, next Thursday on the 4th. Miss Jasper is going to do something with her algebra kids on either the 3rd or the 4th. So rather than have you have many of your tests on the same day, I think I'm going to speed through this lesson a little bit today so that I'm able to give you the test next Tuesday. That way you don't have them all sort of lined up right in a row on the same day, which would be a little bit unfortunate for you. And really all that means is that instead of talking about Gettysburg on one day and the Gettysburg Address on a separate day, we're going to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address just all on the same day, which is today. First, let's just review yesterday's work. So last week we talked about inflation and how a significant lack of resources in the South contributed to sort of their demise of day-to-day life. You mix that in with the lack of prisoner exchange with the prisoners of war after the massacre at Fort Pillow, and you are left with some really grisly, awful scenes from what had happened. So that's what yesterday's lesson was about. Prisoner, the system of prisoner exchange, pardon me, went awry. Had some examples of what happened in Elmira, New York. Primary sources in Andersonville with the images that you saw in the video, and then we talked about Henry Wirz, who was the leader of the leader of Andersonville. At least he was in charge, and how perhaps fairly, perhaps unfairly, he was executed for what had happened at Andersonville. One of the very few people to be directly executed, when in reality, on one hand, how much power did he really have to control how much food was given to the prisoners of war at Andersonville? On the other hand, a truly awful scene. So somebody had to be take the bullet, as it were. So the questions were there, and the ones that I looked at, most of you were getting those correct. Now we move on to, where am I? There. We move on to Gettysburg, and we'll also talk a little bit about Robert E. Lee, which is a good name for you to know, I think, in history. Um, Maybe didn't do the best things, but I think it probably a household name for a lot of people. So lesson 8, Robert E. Lee and Gettysburg. Gettysburg, a couple of weeks ago, or maybe last week, I talked about Shiloh being the largest battle ever in the Western Hemisphere until that point, right? So that was until the spring of 1862. Well, Gettysburg still holds that title. Okay, so the 3 days in July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in 1863, outside Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, remained the largest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. So that's sort of amazing when you think about the history there. So anyway, that's why one of the reasons why Gettysburg is such a big deal. You could say that it is definitely a bit of a turning point, even though the South had been very successful militarily. We talked about some of the problems they had with the Anaconda Plan, with the food riots. But militarily, they're doing well. They're winning at Chancellorsville. They're winning at Fredericksburg. They fought a second battle at Bull Run in Manassas, Virginia. They had won that. And now, because he knows he can't keep fighting the war forever, because the North has better they have better provisions. They're set up more for victory. Lee decides we're going to invade the North. Because if they can go to the outskirts of a city like Baltimore or Philadelphia, then maybe the North will quit. They'll see that this is not something, this is not a war that they can win. So Lee brings his Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania, into the North now, right? We're no longer fighting in Maryland, which was a border state. We're no longer fighting in Virginia. Now we're actually fighting in the North into Gettysburg. And over these 3 days, a giant battle ensues. So the reading, I mean, I'm not going to give you pages and pages on Gettysburg, although there are, entire novels, books about Gettysburg. There are documentaries about Gettysburg. I did include an animated map here that's probably about 12, 15 minutes long if you'd like to take a look. Um, there's something called Pickett's Charge, which was a failed attempt by the South to break the Union forces. You can see some of the numbers here: 90,000 Union troops, 75,000. But the ultimate, the ending is what matters most, which is that the South lost. Okay, so this was the first time in quite a little string, especially in the spring of 1863, that Lee had been defeated, and because he lost more men, the losses that the South uh, were forced to endure mattered more than the losses for the North. Now, that's not to say that their lives mattered more, but just that the South didn't have many people fighting for them compared to the North. So anybody that they lose counted almost twice as much. So the Battle of Gettysburg is won by the North, and Lee's army, as it even says right here in the reading, over 1/3 of Lee's army, 28,000 lay dead or wounded. Now, this is coupled with what happened on the other side of the country in Vicksburg, Mississippi. So if you look at my cursor, Vicksburg, Mississippi is about halfway up Mississippi, and it's right on the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River forms the border between all of these states right here. The Union controlled all of the Mississippi River except for Vicksburg, which meant that it could not freely bring ships from its north up here down to the port of New Orleans because Vicksburg was in the way. So instead of fighting Vicksburg, what the North did was they laid a siege. So they surrounded Vicksburg by land and on the water. They bombarded the small city with artillery, and then wouldn't let any supplies through. And then finally, Vicksburg did surrender. And this happened the very next day after the Battle of Gettysburg was over. So this happened July 4th. Yes, the 4th of July, 1863. So, I mean, when you talk about like a turning point, the Battle of Gettysburg is won and the siege of Vicksburg is successful, all on in the same weekend, basically, for the North. That was a huge couple of huge victories for the Union. So that's the Battle of Vicksburg, which is mentioned here. I should say the siege of Vicksburg's, and it talks about how the Anaconda Plan, Scott's Great Snake, is starting to be successful. A little bit more about Robert E. Lee. So Grant, we talked about earlier, that really the only thing that he did well was he was a soldier. He tried being a tax collector. He tried being a farmer. He tried being in real estate. All of those things failed, but he was an excellent soldier. And eventually that was noticed by Lincoln, and he achieved the rank of lieutenant general, something that hadn't been achieved in our country since the days of George Washington. Robert E. Lee, his path was a little bit more straightforward. He was also a military man throughout. He came from a very military family. His father was actually somebody who rode with George Washington, but his father was very much absent in his life. Lee was pretty much raised by his mother. He graduated high in his class at West Point. Both these gentlemen went to West Point. He had a higher command during the Mexican-American War than General Grant did. Of course, he's older. He's like, what, 12 years older, maybe? And Robert E. Lee, like as I said, was very successful. His home, the Arlington House, that's where Arlington National Cemetery is here. Once that land was taken away from him after he had decided to leave the Union and fight for the Confederacy instead. But he was steady leadership. So while the North was going through Grant and General Meade and McDowell and McClellan, of course, and Burnside and Hooker, the North was doing that. The South had Robert E. Lee. He was their rock there. So ultimately, he did end up losing, of course. What happened to him after the war? We actually became the president of a college. He sort of faded into, he took a step back. He wasn't looking to be a senator, be a governor, be anything like that. But there was a small college in Virginia called Washington College, and he agreed to be the president. And then that college is currently called Washington and Lee. But he passed away soon thereafter. He died in 1870, so he didn't live for much longer after the Civil War ended. So a couple questions there about Gettysburg, and then the comparison between Grant and Lee. All right, so now we jump to the Gettysburg Address. Okay, so this is short. Um, it's just three slides here. I would suggest to you that you listen to the recording. It's the recording from the Ken Burns documentary, and it's, as you can see, it's not very long. So the Battle of Gettysburg takes place July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in 1863. A few months later, in on November of 1863, President Lincoln arrives to dedicate a soldier's cemetery to many of the men who died there. Okay, so this is a very somber occasion. This isn't, they're not celebrating the victory at Gettysburg. They're dedicating a battlefield as a resting place for many of these soldiers. And this is the speech that he delivers. And as you can see, it's pretty short. So what I'd like to do is go through some of it with you, just to talk about, what exactly is he saying here, and why is he saying it. So for the first paragraph, 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent. A score is 20 years. So 4 times 20 is 80, plus 7, 87. So if you, in your head, you subtract 87 from 1863, math, 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 it's 1776, okay, the same year that the Declaration of Independence was written. So this is another example of Lincoln asking the people, even though they weren't alive, to go back to when America was founded. He did the same thing as first inaugural address when he talked about the Patriot graves and Heart and Hearthstone. Here, he's asking people to go back. And he's referring to the idea that all men are created equal, those words written by Thomas Jefferson that were included in the Declaration of Independence. This is him again. 1863 was a big year as far as anti-slavery, because it's when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. And then he's also talking about it here. Remember, I mentioned last week that the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves only in the Confederacy, but it was still an anti-slavery measure, that was important because it gave a moral reason for fighting the war for the North. It wasn't just, hey, let's keep the country together. No, it was, we need to win, and we will be the liberators of millions of people who are enslaved. He continues. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation may live. So again, that's the intended purpose of him being there. That this was a battlefield in July. Now we are taking part of it and making it a soldier cemetery in Gettysburg, which of course is still there. But he continues on. So the first purpose, that's what he states in the second paragraph. Hey, this is why we're here, why on this November day, is to dedicate a portion of the battlefield as a cemetery. But he continues on. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. So what he's saying there is that the people who are alive in November 19th, 1863, we're not the ones who are going to make this land special. Okay. We're not the ones who are going to give importance to this land. Who were the ones who gave importance to this land? Who were the ones who made this place special? The soldiers, right? The soldiers who fought there in July, fought and lived, or fought or died. They're the ones. It's another example of Lincoln, even though, the guy's 6'4", he had been a soldier, he had actually been a wrestling champion when he was younger. So when you think about Abraham Lincoln, you kind of think of this tall, sort of gangly guy with the hat and the beard. But he was like, he was 6'4". That's tall now, let alone back, 150 years ago. But he's being very humble, right? It's the same way, and he has this throughout many of his speeches, including his first inaugural address, that he's not here to make himself important. He's here to put the spotlight on other people. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So he's talking about the same thing, that the people who were here in July are the ones who should be honored. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Well, turns out he's wrong about that, right? Because the Battle of Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address are, or I don't know if I would rank them, but they're probably equally famous. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we shall take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. So essentially, what happens here is Lincoln is encouraging the people who are listening, the people in the North, to continue the fight, right? Yes, there was horrible loss, and there has been horrible loss with the Civil War, but the people here were devoted to a cause, and we should continue that same devotion, right? That the people who fought and died to end slavery, right? He's making this this is a war of liberation now, not just a war of union. The people who fought gave so much to advance the cause, um, and we need to continue that. And he talks about that they gave their last full measure of devotion. Well, what do you think that means? What how devoted can you be to something? You give your life for it. So that's what he's talking about here. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. When you do something in vain, you might work really hard at doing something, at completing something, but ultimately you don't get the payoff. There's no benefit to it. You did it for nothing. So he's saying that if the soldiers who died here, right, the tens of thousands, even though the Union won, they still lost a lot of men. If we stop the fight now and allow the Confederacy to leave and allow slavery to continue, then what they did was for naught, and we don't want that. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. So that's a very famous part of the Gettysburg Address, right? The old birth of freedom would have been the independence for the country. Again, going back to the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, right? But we need a new birth of freedom, and that is continuing on as a united country, but continuing on as a country without slavery. At that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So very famous last lines there. Okay. Question I give you here. I do. Question I do. What are two things Lincoln is trying to accomplish? So I talked about this a little while ago, that this paragraph right here kind of does one thing, but the longer, more loquacious, flowery paragraph does another. So what are those two things? All right, so a little bit long, but I want it, like I said, it's all sort of to make it so you're not overwhelmed with tests next week, at least on the same day. So Gettysburg, lesson 8, Gettysburg Address, lesson 9. So you've got one question to answer from lesson 9, and you have 3 questions to answer going back to lesson 8. All right. Hopefully you guys will enjoy the day. And it's sunny here. I'm sure it's sunny where you are in Epping too. All right. Talk to you guys later. Bye.